why this journal is Southeast Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of. Going up. Is there a date line?
Yeah, well, not named on, but there are.
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an extra one. Yeah, I'm surprised that there's still so many sitting there, but we'll wait a few minutes.
Oh, really? Somehow it's not valid. That's communication. So it's like perfect. It is. Well, it was actually a real break. The sequence of boundaries within 1 year went to second edition, and then was went to paperback, and then
All right.
So, a good year.
You don't play with this. You can say nothing.
So,
It's not really my. Communication engineering.
Oh, okay.
And I'm more.
Oh,
Exactly.
Is there anyone who ordered a lunch and doesn't remember what one they ordered?
Yes.
It's one in college. And then like it goes library.
Sugar or cream? Yeah, it was just incredible stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. There are names on something. What's your like 700 megabytes, like you said.
That's why we don't have that last mile problem.
Hassan, you had the 81? Did you say it's Ray? Ray. Did you just add this today?
Yes.
Okay. We put the order in on Friday afternoon, so unfortunately we didn't get your order in time.
I think that
You had a 75 back there. Okay.
I can drink.
I was in two.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Good remember.
So the missing ability to understand.
I do. What's your name? What am I doing? There we go.
4 years.
Sam T. Louis 19 is what that is.
I'll read just a primer, just an introduction. So based on linear models. Oh yeah, that's, you know, kind of like when people hear that, I still put things like, this is the field I'm struggling with your computer. Not linear, but we don't. Very short.
I really want to hear
Sounds good.
So I think we'll get started. We're very fortunate to have Peter Railton. I sat in on his From Actions to Ethics class a few years ago, and I thought, when I saw slime molds, I thought, I need to bring him to Seesaw and get a really good conversation going between the humanists on that side of the campus and the mathematicians on this side of the campus. And so Peter has agreed to talk. The title is The Self and Action Slime Molds in Organization.
Actually, if I could just quickly, I'll pass this around, and if you could write your name down on it. We just need your name so we can sort of keep track of who's showing up to our events.
Well, thank you guys for coming. This is, I feel as if I were like the dumbest thing in the world for someone like a humanist like myself walking over here and talking about a self-organizing system. But I was thinking that maybe I could throw out a philosophical problem with what looks to me like a solution, and then you could tell me something about whether this seems plausible or interesting, or whether it might lead to something further down the line, like my embarrassment and correction. Okay, so everybody has to start with a motto. In any paper that talks about psychology, it's got to get its motto from William James. And so the principle I want you to have in the back of your mind while I'm talking is James's dictum that my thinking is first and last and always from my doing. And I want you also to think about doing in particular, because doing has an unusual structure. Doing always starts in the present and extends into the future. It doesn't start in the present and extend into the past. And that means if your thinking is always for your doing, then your thinking is always by its nature going to have a future orientation. That is, the basic function in thinking is not to, say, represent past events or something like that. That's good information, you want to use it, but the main job is to translate that kind of information into an orientation toward the future. And if you accept that basic framework, then I think we can begin to make some progress on this question. So this is an old problem. Philosophers worry about the nature of the self, and historically there have been all kinds of theories about the self. It's some kind of immortal soul, insubstantial substance, a bundle of percepts, transcendent. It is a relation on experience itself. These are all philosophical theories. And I don't want to try to sell you on any one of those theories today, because I think we can begin in a much more nuts and bolts way to think about the self. I'll be the nuts. The two dimensions of the self in particular are that people worry about are the self as agent. So what is it that makes an action of mine intentional, done for a reason of mine, like reaching out and grasping this bottle? And what makes the self a locus of thought and feeling, like a unified point of consciousness, what unifies my experience? And I will focus on one today, and I think this is really the basic question to focus on. Again, think of James's dictum. Evolution really didn't care about whether I represented the world with technicolor or whether I had interesting speculative thoughts. My ancestors were selected for what they did, and so if evolution was paying any attention to what was going on inside the heads of Homo sapiens at all, it was doing it primarily through the way they're translated into behavior. And so if we can understand what it is to be an acting self, maybe that's going to help us understand these other dimensions of the self. Okay, now here's the model that was at one point the dominant model in philosophy. This is called the belief-desire model of what it is for an action to be intentional, to be my action. And the basic idea of the belief-desire model is fairly simple. You desire a certain outcome O, so you represent some future state of affairs with a pro attitude. You have a belief under a certain characterization that a certain action will conduce to the realization of that outcome. And then these two jointly cause the action. So this is just like a causal picture. You've got belief and you've got desire. And what makes the action intentional is that belief and desire together constitute what's called an intention. That's what it is to have an intention. And these cause the action. And that's what it is for the action to be intentional. Now, philosophers began to worry about this model very soon because they worried that this model doesn't enable us to explain certain classic kinds of cases. These are cases that are called deviant cases or compulsive cases, so they sound more interesting than the usual one. Typical deviant case, so I've got a belief and a desire. I'm an alpinist and I've got a rival and I want to eliminate my rival. I believe that if I'm holding a rope that secures this individual above me on the rock face, and I want to see that individual fall to his death, all I have to do is let go of the rope and this will happen. And I can tell people down at the bottom of the mountain that this was an accident of some terrible sort. So I've got this belief, this will do it, my desire to get rid of my rival. But the thing is that those make me so nervous, those two thoughts, thinking, about killing my rival, that I realize I've let the rope slip and my rival falls to his death. And so belief and desire have caused an action and they have brought about the intended result of the action, killing my rival, but that doesn't look like it's an intentional action on my part. It doesn't look like it was my action. A second kind of example is you've got Oedipus. You remember Oedipus was the fellow who had the unfortunate fate of killing his father and marrying his mother. And so we got Oedipus hurrying off to go kill his father. And in the way, he comes across an elderly gentleman in the road who's walking very slowly. It's very much annoying to Oedipus. I've got to get to town, kill my father, please get out of my way. And so he takes his club and he clubs this man, knocks him to the side of the road into the ditch and goes on. And now it turns out that this man was his father. Didn't know that. He believed he was going to kill his father. And he believed that this clubbing is a killing. So he believes you can kill your father by clubbing. And he desired to kill his father. And he did indeed, as a result of those desires and beliefs, take an action which resulted in the killing of his father. But we don't think that's, again, he didn't intentionally kill his father. He intentionally killed this unfortunate old man who just happened to be his father. So those are cases where belief and desire come together, but they don't seem to come together in the right way to cause action. And then there are what are called coercive and unwanted desire cases where, yes, belief and desire cause the action, but the desire itself is caused by some extraneous force, maybe an addiction or a compulsion, and the action seems to lose intentionality. I'm going to look at the first kind of case, the deviant causal cases. And so one thing that philosophers have tried to do to solve this problem is to do what's called bringing the agent back in. And so we still have the belief and we still have the desire, but the job of the agent is to make sure that these get combined to produce the action. And so we introduce the agent as an active organizer of belief and desire. And that's sort of what's not happening in the alpinist case. The agent isn't organizing the belief and desire into a rope letting go behavior. It's just causal circumstance that's doing it. And so here's a typical remark. The agent's interactions with his mental states are such that they couldn't have with themselves. His role is to intervene between reasons and intention, between intention and bodily movements. That's what's missing. The agent can make the weaker motive prevail. This is in the case where you're resisting temptation by throwing his weight behind the weaker motive, and in that sense, animate his behavior. Or to will an end is not just to cause it, or even to allow an impulse in me to operate as its cause, but so to speak, to consciously pick up the reins and make myself the cause of the end. And Searle has this image that the agent has to insert himself between the belief and the desire, and then between the belief and desire and the action, in order to make it his or her action. Now, I hope you can all see that this is a proposal of a kind that's really problematic. First of all, they launch a regress. In order for my belief and desire to constitute a proper cause of my action, what do I need? I need some more actions. I need an intervening, or a throwing of weight, or a picking up of reins. And so in order to get this action, I have to have another action. But wait a second, in order to get that other action, it would seem I'd have to have another action. I'd have to pick up the reins and intervene. I'd have to throw my weight behind intervening. I'd have to become the agent of the belief and the desire that were the belief and desire that explain why it is that I took up the reins in just this way to make my belief. So, as you can see, this just launches a regress. For every action, we need another action, and then another and another. And moreover, they bring the agent back in as a kind of homunculus. The agent is intervening between his mental states. The agent is inside there somewhere picking up some reins. So this is not really a model of agency at all. It's a model of how if you had a little man inside you who could pick up reins or throw weight around, then your behavior could look a lot like agency. But that would make it seem as if it were the little man's agency and not your own. So these theories, it seems to me, can't possibly work. And you might say, well, I guess we're back to the belief-desire model, and how are we supposed to make this work? Now, one way to make it work would be to say, well, maybe instead of adding something to belief and desire as a kind of an extra agential force, maybe we should look inside belief and desire. Maybe they have enough structure inside them such that when they come together, they can yield intentional action. And so in that way, we don't try to get this global pattern of behavior, of intentional action, by introducing another global intentional action. We get that by some kind of a local interaction of the features of beliefs and desires to crystallize something that could count as an intention. Okay. And so I'm going to say this is a potential example of a self-organizing process. You need, is to say, for a pattern at the global level, like my Peter Railton reaching out and grabbing this bottle, that's a global pattern, to emerge from numerous interactions among lower level components, like beliefs and desires. None of those are actions, none of those are agents. If those could combine together in the right way to produce that kind of a global pattern, then we could get belief, desire, directed agency of the right kind, but without an inner agent and without a regress. And so the rules specifying the interactions among the components, which are going to derive from the character of belief and desire as such, those are executed using only local information without reference to the global pattern. So that's the picture. Now, this would be not only enable us to avoid regress and homunculi, but it would have another interesting pair of features. First of all, we would be looking at what it is that actually produces the behavior. The belief and the desire would be producing the behavior, and that seems right. That is to say, it's not as if when I have belief and desire, we have to say, well, there's belief and desire, and then there's me, and those together produce the behavior. It looks as if my beliefs and my desires, my goals, my aims, my thoughts, those are the producers of the behavior. So they're the causally efficacious agents. You don't need a new person in there somewhere. But moreover, they're an intelligible cause. They're a cause that makes the behavior an expression of what I care about, what I desire, and what I think. And so in that sense, it makes the action self-expressive. I understand the action because I want this outcome, and I think I can bring it about in this way. And those facts are sufficient to make me act in the appropriate way in the circumstances. So, so this is what philosophers spend their time doing. So we're thinking in somewhat mentalistic terms, but you could think of this as a functional diagram as well. And this is a model of desire. And I've got, this came up through quite an independent line of inquiry, but I realize it can be used for the purpose that we have right now. So what is it that makes desire different from just appetite? So you've got an animal, the animal's in a hunger state. In that hunger state, it's motivated to seek food. It maybe has some past conditioning which tells it how to go from hunger to food. maybe taking the right-hand turn in a maze, maybe following its nose, some tasty morsel hidden in the bushes. So on that picture, you've got an appetite, which is like a deficit state. That produces a motivation, and then that motivation brings you to food, and as you consume the food, you become satiated. That reduces the drive and reinforces the behavior, and so you have this kind of a homeostatic system, a deficit, a drive, a consummatory behavior, satiation, and then the animal is complete. Okay, that's what it would be like to be moved by appetite. Now, what it's like to be moved by desire isn't just like that. So you can be reading the morning newspaper, and you read about this brand new restaurant in Ann Arbor. And it's a kind of restaurant you've never been to. It's a Catalan restaurant. You've never had Catalan food. You're not hungry. You just had a big breakfast. You're not in a deficit state with regard to food. But what do? You really like the idea of trying this restaurant. And as a result of liking the idea of trying that restaurant, even though you have no deficit state right now that leads you to want to eat, what does this do? It makes you want to make it the case that you go to the restaurant in the evening. And as a result, if you could see something as part of that, like picking up the telephone to make a reservation, you would want to pick up the telephone and make a reservation. So desire is distinctive from mere appetite, because when we desire something, we have a favorable representation, an effectively charged positive representation, that elicits in us a degree of motivated activity, of a directed motivation toward the object that's represented. Now, there's another interesting feature of desire, which is, unlike the drive idea, you can act on this desire. You can get there to the Catalan restaurant, you can try the food, and if the outcome is extremely disappointing, then what happens, this is going to reduce how much you like the idea of going to that restaurant. And so there's a learning structure built into desire. It's part of the nature of desire that you're paying attention to whether the object that your representation refers to actually does indeed have as much likability as you thought it had. And so in that sense, desire has got built into it a kind of a feedback structure. Okay, that's just a philosopher's diagram. What about belief? Well, belief has a very similar structure, I think. Belief involves some degree of confidence or trust in what? In a representation. Beliefs have representational objects. They're not just a mere expectation. A flatworm can have a mere expectation. Humans have beliefs. They've got representational contents. They can reason with these things. They draw conclusions and so on. And so in the case of belief, you've got, again, an effective state, a degree of confidence or trust toward a representation. But what does that do? That elicits in you a degree of expectation toward the object that's represented. So if I think that picking up the telephone will enable me to get to call the Catalan restaurant, I have this representation. If I pick up now the number, I can get to the Catalan restaurant. That makes me expect that when I go over and pick up the telephone, I'll be able to do it. If in fact the telephone is dead, the outcome doesn't correspond to that, then I no longer expect that by continuing to pick up this telephone, I'm going to be able to call a restaurant. And in this way, beliefs can come and go very rapidly. I don't need a long period of training. I can very quickly learn, don't try the telephone, you need to get to the restaurant another way. Okay, so let's just look at those states and realize there's similarity in structure. They both involve an effective attitude toward a representation. They both have an action guiding or action of motivating state in here, wanting or expecting. They have enough intentionality to give you an object of the representation. And then they have enough feedback structure to give you some kind of learning. So what would happen if you had a representation, like the representation of this Catalan restaurant, and you inferred from that representation, because it's an idea, oh, I won't be able to get in the restaurant unless I can get a seat in the restaurant. I won't be able to get a seat unless I can make a reservation. I won't be able to make a reservation unless I make So what happens when you've got a representation that you're confident of, making a telephone call would help me get a reservation, which would help me get food at this restaurant, and a very favorable representation of eating the food in the restaurant. What if you could have a representation like that that recruits both confidence and liking? So it can crystallize those two elements, and you get action. You get action when a representation crystallizes both a degree of confidence and a degree of attraction, such that it elicits in you a degree of motivation and expectation towards some object, which is typically going to be an act, performing an act. And that's going to set you up to be either disappointed or satisfied with the result of the action. Does it result when you bring about this state of affairs? And if you bring about this state of affairs, is it as good as you expect it to be or not so? So in a sense, if belief and desire have that much structure, and if they can crystallize out around a common representation, then they can give your action enough structure to get you involved in a global directed activity with an intention, with an expectant motivation that you've got governed by a representation, and which will guide the way you behave in the world via an intentional relationship. Okay, so that would be a way in which belief and desire could, if they could combine together, result in action. And they could combine together because they have a common structure and they share elements, like representational elements, like affective elements. Okay, now does anything like this actually happen? Does anybody know Schultz's work on reinforcement learning? Okay, so I'm sorry to tell you, this is a macaque. Got some microelectrodes inserted into its ventral striatum, which is a region of dopamine neurons which project out and which have to do with the regulation of action. And this is a case of reinforcement learning. So what have we got? We've got the macaque sitting in a chair with these microelectrodes, and nothing much is happening, and so you're getting what's called tonic firing. The macaque is mildly bored. You can see nothing's happening. At point R, you have a little tube in its mouth, and it squirts sweet juice, and you get the spike of the dopamine neurons when the sweet juice arrives. Well, that must be the pleasure, right? These are dopamine neurons. That must be the pleasure of the juice. Well, this is about learning, so let's try something new. Let's turn on a light a second and a half before the juice arrives. So we turn on this light, and what we find is after 5, 10, 15, 20 trials, this spike moves from the point of the juice arrival to the time the light comes on. Now, does that mean that the macaque no longer likes the juice and likes the light instead? No, it means it does still like the juice. It means that this has become an indicator, an expectation, a signal that juice is on the way. And that's a positive thing. And if the juice arrives on schedule, and it's neither better nor worse than expected, then there's no updating. There's no new information in the system. So this is what happens when you've got a fully predicted squirt of juice at point R. And how do we know that's what's going on? Let's give it no juice at point R and see what happens. And this is an astonishing event. Usually you don't see just complete gaps in mental activity. Right? Typically there's some kind of bouncing around going on. This is a strong error signal. And if you pull this trick enough times, what will happen is that little spike, that spike will become smaller and go away. Now, what's interesting is in the wake of this experiment, they've done similar kinds of experiments, varying the probability with which the juice arrives, varying the amount of juice, the intensity of the juice. And what you find in these same areas of the brain is at probability 0, that is no expectation of juice, when the reward arrives, you get a full spike when the reward arrives. At probability 1, you get a full spike when the stimulus comes on and no activity here at the reward. At probability 0.5, you get a little bit smaller spike here, and you get some spike here. At probability 0.75, a bigger expectation here, news here, the expectation is real. And 0.25, a weaker expectation, and more news, therefore, when the juice arrives. Moreover, this is a spike train recording. If you look at this, it's not maximal. This is the spike train we're looking at, this period. When is it going to be maximal? Well, not at probability 1, because there's no anticipation of probability 1. You know what's going to happen. Not at probability 0, because you know what's going to happen. That is nothing. You have no expectation. It's highest at probability 0.5. And so this is a reward, this is a risk function. This is calculating reward or expected value, and this is calculating amount of risk or anticipation. And so what's actually going on in the brain of this macaque is a kind of a feedback mechanism that allows a symbol like this stimulus to acquire an expected value And if you then go on and you start looking at the choice behavior of macaques or rats in their laboratory, you can predict their choice behavior when you understand the firing of these kinds of neural ensembles. And so what's going on then when they're going through their training in the maze, it turns out, isn't that they're learning a motor routine, like turning right. Indeed, the behaviorists early on realize that can't be it fully, because if the rat escapes from the start box, it runs right over to the food over here. Why did it do that? Well, that's because it has a representation of where the food is, and it has a high expected value of heading off in that direction. And so the picture that emerges from this is a picture that the organism forms a map of its environment, not just its physical environment, but of its potential action environment, in which these values correspond to the expected values of the corresponding actions. And if you understand this map, you'll understand the way in which the organism is going to choose. And you can remap the landscape by changing the frequency, intensity, probability, value of the different rewards. And so in that sense, the organism is set up in such a way as to do the kind of business that we are asking belief and desire to do. And it does it with its affective system. That's where most of this activity is going on. And so we do have affective attitudes toward representations, like lights coming on. That elicits a degree of expectant wanting toward an outcome, and depending upon the outcomes, fulfilling or not fulfilling, we get feedback from it. Okay, and how would this actually look? This is a somewhat speculative model from two neuroscientists who work on these questions. The idea is something like this. You try and make a decision to go left or right in a maze. This would be one decision, this would be the other. Initially, you start off in a little potential well here. How do you get over into one side or the other of the decision? Well, you'll have two dopamine neurons. They're being loaded up with weights, decision weights. And depending upon the system, either when one of these gets relative to the other sufficiently far ahead, you'll get action. Or when one of these builds to a threshold, you'll get action. And so the animal really is loading up decision weights on possible actions, and on the strength of that, making a choice. Okay, now this suggests then that there are components of our mental representation of our environment which, when they crystallize in the right way, can produce action that is guided by a representation based on an evaluation of that representation, a pro-attitude, just as the original theory tells us, and that there's motivation in terms of that pro-attitude. Now, can self-organization do this kind of thing? And you're the ones who can tell me that. Can you have a self-organized system of these kinds of components that can crystallize out this sort of global behavior? And that's why I find slime molds interesting, because slime molds do just this sort of thing. For example, a slime mold, when it gets sufficiently food deprived, instead of going out and exploring its environment by spreading its tendrils, it will instead collect back together and form a fruiting body in order to reproduce before it runs out of energy. This is a case where all the interactions are local. They depend upon the changing state of the organism and the environment. But what they do is they key in local interactions that interlock with each other in such a way that you'll eventually get the result of a complicated, organized structure. So let me just, if you haven't seen these films of slime molds in action, they're really quite interesting. So this is a slime mold solving a maze. Okay. So this fellow is in his kitchen. It's a scientific experiment. You can see he's putting little oats at either end of a maze. The maze has been filled with an exploring slime mold, which is basically, at this point, just a bag of amoeba-like cells with no structural organization. And what does it do? Well, the ones that are right next to the food, they're doing fine. They've got themselves some food. But then there's a backward propagation from that, from the discovery of food there, that over time causes withdrawal of the slime mold from the parts of the maze which are not appropriately connected to food. And what you'll see as this video goes on is that slowly, slowly, the organism solves the maze. It finds the shortest path between the food. And so here you can see it's withdrawing from these parts of the maze. It didn't find food there, it's withdrawing from there. It's drawing through this part of the maze. And so eventually, here's the pattern that you get. Okay. So nice job, slime mold. You solved the maze. Okay. So that's our first example. Our second example, I want to show you a slime mold forming a fruiting body, because I didn't want Huffington Post it on. Let's see if I can get. So this is John Bonner's work at Princeton. Slime molds can do things like move in an organized way. So this is a big bag of cells which are moving as a unit. They can, if they wish, for example, separate and come back together for purposes of exploration. But what I wanted to show you in particular was how they can form a fruiting body. So this is a slime mold, which is just a disorganized bag of cells, which has been deprived of food, and so it's doing its last chance. It's forming a fruiting body. So it forms these stalks. And again, it's entirely, there's no central message going out. It forms these stalks. These are dying off here to make a rigid stalk. And at the top, you get a fruiting body, which is able to reproduce by releasing spores. Okay, so what does that tell us? Well, we know that slime molds have high degrees of relatedness. So they've studied the degree of relatedness among cells. They can ward off, they can actually fight off cheating cells that are trying not to be in the stalk, but in the fruiting body. And your brain could be like that, right? The cells in your brain have a very high degree of relatedness. They could cooperate in just this way, starting off with simple organisms and building up to complicated ones like you with very powerful representational powers to create something like the sorts of leaf desire structures I was describing, and those can nucleate organized action. Now, I want to go just one step further, which is you might think there's still a mystery, which is why does action of this kind that's crystallized by belief and desire, why does that seem like my action? And of course, often it doesn't, because I think most of this is not conscious. Most of the things we do is under various kinds of unconscious intentional regulation. But what about the conscious part? Why does it seem like my action? And now I need to pull in one more bit of a priori thought. People know the good regulator theorem? Familiar? Okay, this is a theorem from systems theory, Conant and Ashby. Under very broad conditions, any regulator, so like a thermostat, for example, or the system that's monitoring the behavior of a large oil refinery, any regulator that is both maximally successful, bless you, and simple must be isomorphic with the system studied, which means, in effect, that a good regulator for a system's got to build a model of that system. And the way in which it regulates the system is based on the model. So a smart thermostat, as opposed to the dumb ones that I have at home, a smart thermostat pays attention to when I turn it up and when I turn it down, pays attention to the pattern over the day, the pattern over the week, and eventually it builds up a little model of Peter Railton's heat preferences. And it can, by anticipating those, more efficiently regulate the temperature in the building. So I don't have to come downstairs and turn it on full or set it way back. It'll anticipate that, and the house will be ready for me in the temperature I want. That's a feed-forward feedback system. It's the same thing that gives you discs, that gives you recommendations on Netflix or Amazon. These are systems that use information to update a model. And it's a forward model. It's a model that regulates expectation going forward. And what they found in elite athletes, for example, is that they differ from very good athletes, not in their fine motor skills, not in the amount that they practiced, but in the complexity, accuracy, and speed with which they can access a forward dynamic model of the situation, of its possibilities. That's how a really good tennis player knows right where to put the ball without having to go through an elaborate computation, because that player is capable of modeling the situation just a little bit better than his opponent, and therefore can anticipate, he's a little better predictor than the opponent, anticipate where to put the ball, and the opponent can't predict where his opponent is going to put it. Okay, so within those models, then there's going to be a critical distinction between changes that are initiated by you and changes that are initiated in the environment. Okay, so think of this as like the difference between standing outside and having it rain versus standing in the shower stall and turning the shower on. In both cases, you get rained on from above, but in one case, if your system represents it as something you've done, like causing the rain, then you're going to be surprised the next day when your plants are wilting and you can't cause the rain. It's going to have to represent that as exogenously caused. In the same way, if you just walk into your shower stall and hope it'll rain, you're not going to be on time for this complex system seminar. So part of your modeling is where do you attribute the source of the cause? And it turns out that this is a continuous process. People who study fine motor behavior, like reaching out to this bottle, your forward model is continuously generating a stream of expectations and feedback. And if that stream is interrupted in some way, you actually won't experience it as your action. So there are these nice cases where they can stimulate your brain. You are reaching out for water and they stimulate your brain so that the action is no longer controlled by your arm, but by this transcranial magnetic stimulation. And the action feels as if your hand were just doing this. And so what explains the difference between a non-deviant and a deviant causal chain is whether the right part of the model, the part of the model that represents the behavior as brought about by you, is continuously encoding the expectation that's governing the action, that's giving you the feedback from the behavior. And that's what's missing in the case of the alpinist with the rope, right? The part of the model that's guiding that, in fact, the model in particular isn't guiding that because he's just gotten nervous and that makes his grip bad. So it will not seem to him like his action. His model didn't expect that. His model didn't initiate that. And in the case of Oedipus, the part of his model is clubbing this old man is not the representation that involves his father and the killing of his father, but the part that involves clearing the road of an old man. Okay, so in that sense, the idea that it's my behavior and that it's my behavior under a description, that comes from this very notion of a model. Okay, so what we've got then is an interaction effect. We've got belief and desire, which can, by the way they're designed, generate a model because they're designed to give you feedback and update on information. That's how they work. They can help you generate a model. That model, therefore, can, through this crystallizing effect of belief and desire around common representation, can generate organized action, which will feel like your own because it's under the control of, indeed, your beliefs and your desires in the right kind of way. Thank you.
What about a model that includes making a model? Some complex system model. Some people argue that that piece of a complex system model is a mental model being made.
Yeah. There's a mental model being made.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's right. I think a mental model is being made. So if you look at the structure of belief and desire, what they're doing is in effect a kind of exploratory phenomena. They're giving you something that initiates action, and that action carries with it an expectation which can then be fulfilled or not. And that can then be used to update your expectation. And so in that sense, what comes out of these and what we're seeing in these pictures of learning behavior is the building of a model of this kind of the environment.
Which may include the building of a model.
Yeah. And in creatures like us who have meta-representational capacities, then that is something that we can perform. A flatworm probably can't do that, I suppose. I don't know. You're the expert on this.
None that I have met.
None that you have met, yeah. But certainly a system like ours can do that. And one good reason for doing that is this kind of bottom-up learning is all very good, but there are times that you have to worry about a bottom-up system. Like if you're trying to solve a problem and what you need is a new idea rather than just more data. You keep trying to solve the problem in the same way, what you need is a new idea. What you need is to keep track of whether your model is stalling out. and not yielding fresh solutions. And so in that sense, you need an ability not just to model the environment, but to keep track of how you're doing with that model, which is a regulative task, a new second order modeling task. Yes.
So it seems that your like desire diagram is like a diagram because it just seems that like, you're saying that desire for X is that X is good. Would that be correct?
It's not just belief that X is good, because belief that X is good would yield an expectation of something from X. But what we need is something that yields more than expectation. It's got to yield some kind of motivational force.
Oh, well, what do you mean? In the previous slide, you mean by expectation that thing is true? Like,
Yeah, it's an expectation that this object conforms to that representation.
okay.
Yeah, and so let's say you read this review of the Catalan restaurant, that causes you to form, you trust the reviewer to some extent, you believe the review, that leads you to expect to a certain extent that the review is going to correspond to the actual dinner.
Okay.
And so if it doesn't, what you'll revise is your confidence in the reviewer. Yeah.
And in the other slide, so we have the degree of one thing, and I'm wondering how is one thing different from like expecting that something is good. Intuitively, they seem different, but to define desire in terms of one seems a bit certain.
Yeah, yeah, and so actually, if you go over across the walkway here over to the East Hall, the person to ask about this is Kent Barrett, who works on the motivational system. And one of the better moments in my intellectual life was when I took diagrams like this to show to Tim, because he was an expert on motivation. I said, do you think there really are these differences between liking and wanting, or something like that? And this is what he does. This is his work, distinguishing these kinds of states. And so, yes, there is, he calls this incentive salience, and this is a distinct phenomenon. This is affective gloss or hedonic representation, and both of them have a very direct, concrete realization in the system of animals as motivating states. Kent Berridge, B-E-R-R-I-D-G-E. Yeah. But it's a good question, because if you had just an expectation, just a belief, but you had no desire for the thing, you wouldn't pursue it. Similarly, if you had a desire, but you had no belief that you could get it, you wouldn't pursue it. And so what you need is the two to be together and to crystallize in the right way. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the simulation literature in cognitive science?
A bit, yeah.
I was thinking this really lines up very well with the basic idea that we've evolved systems for doing multiple simulations for making decisions and then choosing from among those.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is sort of a more basic level, which is good. It's right. What I've read so far has been a higher abstract level, and this puts a little bit of meat on it.
Okay. Good. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I guess I've got a colleague, Chandra Sapata, who works on what's called the default system in the brain. Apparently, it seems to be busy continuously simulating alternative trajectories. And so the organism doesn't just face, this map in effect embodies multiple trajectories, and it explores those. So thank you. I'll want to talk to you some more about that literature.
A quick comment.
Yeah.
Actually, Alan Turing, in 1936, wrote a paper called Morphogenesis,
Yeah.
in which he actually used slime mold as an example.
Really?
And did a very complete discussion on this idea. It's one more thing that Turing did very early on.
Wow.
It's a great paper, and well worth reading if you haven't.
Morphogenesis?
Yeah, it's just called morphogenesis,
Yeah.
and he uses slime mold.
Yeah, right, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to get morphology, pattern, and structure to emerge from something that doesn't have that pattern.
Yeah.
And you might think, well, the only way to do that is to bring something with a pattern to guide it. And the answer is no, and that you couldn't do it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, he was, of course, terribly interested because everything gets sacrificed to get this spore out.
That's right. And evolutionarily, this has been a puzzle. You know, how could you possibly get these things to evolve? Because only the very top cells are going to have a shot. And otherwise, there's just all these amoebas laying down their lives to make this possible. And so there are various genetic models of under what conditions you can get that, what degrees of relatedness and so on. Yeah, thank you. So that's 1936?
Yeah, 1936.
Okay.
Yeah, it shows you the difference and what happens too. I mean, Turing is a real tragedy. I mean,
Yeah.
they affect chemically castrated.
Yeah, I know. It's awful. They lacked the imagination he had.
Exactly. Yeah. But then, you know, they withdrew the security clearance of Oppenheimer factory up this bill.
Yeah.
The atomic bomb. So who knows?
There's so much of this that's great,
Mhm.
because it's like taking functionalism not just as a slogan, but actually trying to pursue the program,
Yeah.
and recruiting everything you can find,
Yes.
including the kitchen sink, in
Yeah.
order to like.
That's right, the kitchen sink was in
functionalism
there.
forward. Yeah, I think that's
It's
great.
full of slime mold.
Yeah.
I've got one area of worry and I've got one question. The area of worry has to do with the two graphs on the belief and the desire. So if you go back to that, what I worry about is that their similarities. I worry. I don't want them to be misleading. And I worry that they might be misleading.
Yeah.
And the reason I worry that they might be misleading is because of the representation in the object box.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure they are the same in the examples that you gave. For
Yeah.
example, the other thing I worry about is so much rides on representation, and so much rides thereby on if the representations are somehow different, it's the coordination between the representations that's going to be crucial.
Yeah.
And I want to hear what you have to say about
Right.
that and how
Good.
how that
Yeah.
how the representation.
Right.
If it's not the same representation, then we've still got belief and desire side by side.
That's right.
If it's the same representation, I want to know what kind of
Right.
structure it has to have to serve
Yeah.
both of these.
Good. Okay, great. So I'll talk about the second one first. So philosophers have been have long argued that representation plays a crucial role in action because depending on the way that I represent the action, it might either be intentional or not intentional. And so I intentionally knocked, if I'm Oedipus, I intentionally killed the old man, but I didn't intentionally kill my father. So those are two different representations of the same state of affairs, killing the old man, killing the father. But because one of the representations was doing the job of regulating the behavior, in that case, it wasn't intentionally killing the father. Okay, so that's an example of the way in which representation actually does mediate action. And in a similar way, you know, think of Lois Lane and Superman. If the mobster starts firing a machine gun, Lois Lane thinks nothing of jumping behind Superman, but she would think it cowardly to jump behind Clark Kent. But it's the same person. Well, why the difference in action? The answer is she represents them. The same individual is represented two different ways. So I think action is mediated by representation, as I think both belief and desire are. Now, how do you get the same one? So in the example I was giving, the first thing that you get is you get this, open up your newspaper and you read this review of the restaurant and you have some degree of confidence in the reviewer. So you've got this representation of eating a meal at this restaurant and it's a good meal and so forth and so on. And you've got some degree of confidence in it based on your previous experience with the reviewer.
It says the first course was delicious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Now that you've got a representation, you can do something with it that you couldn't do if you were a simple animal, which is you can do inferences. Like, oh, a lot of people are going to read this restaurant review. A lot of people are going to want to eat at that restaurant. If I'm going to get a seat tonight, I'm going to have to go and pick up the telephone and make a reservation right now. So I go from this representation by inference to some other representation. So I reach a representation like go and pick up the telephone. And when I reach that representation, I have some degree of confidence that I can do that. I'm capable of going over, reaching the telephone, and if I pick it up, it'll work. So now I have a representation reaching over, making the telephone call to make the reservation. Now, the question is, what I wanted was the meal. Again, the description made me want the meal. But, again, I can do a reference. I can do an inference. I can't get the meal unless I make a telephone call. I can't make a telephone call unless I go over and do it. So now, even though I had no interest before in doing so, I want to pick up the telephone. I'm now motivated to pick up the phone. And so by deliberating both belief and desire, I can get them to converge on a representation, going over and picking up the telephone to make a phone call, which I will both expect to deliver a result and want to do. And so this is the way in which, by getting a common representation, going over and making the phone call, I have recruited both positive credence in that action and positive liking for that. I really do want to pick up the phone, and if you get in my way, I'll say, excuse me, I need to get to the phone.
That worries me for one step more, which is now you've got the relation between the phone representation and the first course delicious representation as an inference. What worries me is that for the same reason that you were objecting to other things as actions, it looks like inference is an action, and I don't want to see another regression in there.
Right. Yeah, so how do we get inference without regression? And again, this is the sort of thing where if you are a network type, what you'll say is you've got this representation of the restaurant, and then you've got available other restaurant representations. They're associated probabilistically with other, associated with those representations probabilistically are crowded restaurants and uncrowded restaurants. And so if you have an associative net, which you're recruiting, and so the inference engine, the nice thing about this model is you can think that you've got, let's say, multiple trains of inference. This goes back to the simulation idea. You got multiple trains of inference going on at any time. You don't have to be supervising those. They're mediated by these probabilistic relations in your causal model of the world. And when those deliver back some things that cohere, then you can get organized action. Yes?
I guess I'm just seeing a tie, too close to a tie in between the belief and the action.
Yeah.
In that if I were to really want to go to this restaurant and pick up the phone and they can't get through because they're not bothering to answer,
right,
that can feed back into me not wanting to go to the restaurant anymore.
Well, the thought would be that what's happened when you pick up the phone, you're now confidently representing that you're not getting through to the restaurant. Does this mean that if someone says to you, "Oh, I got a reservation, you want to come?" You'll say, "Yes, I do want to go."
I don't know. I think like if they're not bothering to pick up the phone, my representation of them is not being very customer service oriented anymore.
Okay, good. So this is another interesting kind of example where you've got this confident representation. This is good restaurant. That leads you to expect that they'll be responsive. When they're not responsive, this reduces your confidence that they're a good restaurant. If you lose confidence that it's a good restaurant, then that weakens your attraction to the idea of going to the restaurant. Yeah.
Let me inject just one more comment. And that is the value of simple models in order to study a system. And we all know Bob Axelrod's Visitor's Dilemma, which enabled us to look at that whole area in a way that we wouldn't have otherwise, or the El Farol problem, where you have to decide whether to go to a restaurant tonight, where you know other people will be using the same kind of decisions. These are really simple models that are terribly important in being able to understand a subject, to make it as simple as possible, to bring out some key aspect. That's very important.
Yeah, and I'm trying to be simple.
These are easy but simple.
What's that?
You would argue, I hope, that these are pretty simple.
Yeah, they're simple in one way, but not so in another.
To write the code for them would be complicated, maybe, but the functional diagram is really.
Well, this is, this whole debate about big data goes along these lines. If you're looking for the big data, you want a few features
Mhm.
that you think are important.
Yeah.
And, there's an awful lot of work in that area, which, in my
Yeah.
humble, not so humble opinion, is basic.
Well, it's interesting. One of the ways people deal with big data, and they did this actually with the Higgs boson, is you use a sort of a Bayesian technique. You start a whole bunch of Bayesian inference engines going with different priors, and they just go out and plow their way through the data. And you run them, and you see which ones are coming up with anything that looks like a high credence.
Yeah.
So, and the interesting thing is when they study these neural nets, and recently, which they can now do at this level of individual electrode in individual neurons, they can actually find Bayesian style.
And the thing that tends to be overlooked
Yeah.
is Bayesian style is correlation.
Yeah.
And we know both the pluses and minuses.
Of that. Yeah. Good.
I'm good.
Oh, actually, someone over here had a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask about, how does one determine the boundaries of the representation? Like, does the representation represent only an object? Can it represent action? Can it represent a set of simultaneous intuitions about a number of actions? And why can't the representation also include those sets of inferences? And maybe you were getting at that with your comment about like, this network associated with processes or something like that. But,
Right.
I mean, I'm thinking like if someone has like a kind of visual representation, like a scene, then there are many objects and actions implied within that scene.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to understand, what then is a representation?
Right. And that's a very good question. And one way to think about representation is that, again, you need to be able to sort of think both locally and globally if you're going to make something like this work. So on the one hand, you might think of a network and you have various nodes of the network. Let's call these representational nodes for the moment. And someone can say, well, what do you believe about this restaurant? And you might say, well, I believe that they'll serve a good meal or something like that. But in fact, you can say, no, you have a much more complicated representation than that. You've got this huge spreading representation which situates it in the restaurant space. And it's all the implicit knowledge you have about restaurants and how you deal with them and so on. And that, I'll say, yes, that's right, you do have that. And what you can think of the node doing is potentiating these associative connections. And that's where the simulation comes in. When we're simulating offline, which we seem to be doing constantly with the default part of our brain, we're following out those patterns of activation that are primed by feeding a particular bit of information in and then letting it the activation spread in various ways. So you're right, that we can think of representation both in the weak sense of, not the weak sense, but in the local sense of a bit of data that's come in. And so we can say, for example, of these little, oops, I went the wrong way on that. We'll say that this spike here, right, it represents an expectation of juice right here, right? It's a little mathematical function. Now, it's not a picture of juice, it's actually a kind of a functional state. And why it gets to be juice relevant is because this state is, in fact, functionally associated with the occurrence or non-occurrence of juice here. And so it gets to have that representational content because of its wider role. Right? There's nothing inherent about that spike that makes it a juice representation, except the way it's connected up to the Macaque's expectations and behavior. So yeah, representation has also that broad sense of it gets the content that it does because it sits in a network rather than being just an isolated. Philosophers sometimes think of that like this little atom of meaning, but if that can't be. No. I know that with past people have to go, but I understand.
Thank you.
Yeah, was there another question?
Yeah, I've got another question.
Yeah. Thank you guys very much.
At the beginning, you said evolution didn't care about our thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. Except.
But this thing is all about thoughts and feelings.
Yeah.
And it had to be evolutionarily chosen.
Yeah.
So I think one of your options is to take that back and say, no, evolution did care about thoughts and feelings because it cared about this system.
Yeah.
Or I think you could say, no, it still just cares about the actions. But if you go, it just cares about the actions, then I want to know, do you think that this coupling of belief and desire through representation is a necessary condition for satisfying the action that evolution suggests? Or is it merely sufficient and maybe even happenstantial that the organisms happen to have this that was evolutionarily recruitable?
Well, that's a good question. What I would want to say is, I think evolution did care about our actions, and this goes back to the sort of good regulator here.
Yeah.
It cares about whether we do a good job of regulating our interactions with the environment, primarily through action. But what that selects for is model building. And so evolution selects for regulation of your interaction with the environment in an effective way. But this is the way that you do it, by building models. And it's the most efficient and reliable way to do it. And so I would say you could probably do it more clumsily in some other way, but this would be the most efficient way. And if a mutation produces this, it'll get selected. And I want to say the belief desire systems, as I've described them, are a part of this idea. Animals lower than humans had appetition, but they didn't have motivation via representation. We get that because we're capable of these higher order representations. And so in that sense, I think our flexibility in action, the fact that humans can change culturally so rapidly, they can adopt a technology, they can do something differently than they've done, they can look over it. All of that came with the flexibility that the belief desire structure gives you. So I don't have to be trained for each new bit of learning.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I would say probably we were selected for something like this because we were selected for action that was flexible, that could adapt to new environments, that could handle bigger societies.
How about the real affect parts?
Yeah.
I mean, because those are the parts that seem hard to select for, or those seem, I mean, if you could get a system that did the same thing without the affect, wouldn't it be on equal or even better, particularly if affect takes energy? Wouldn't the system that did the same thing without all of that fireworks inside be selected for?
It might be, unless, to go back to the point about models and models, think of your self-representational ability. One thing that affect can do to you is summarize a whole bunch of information in such a way that you can use it consciously. So you could have the feeling something's going wrong with this project, or something's going wrong with this dinner, or that person seems a little fishy, and that can cue you to change your behavior. Because there's something in your consciousness that isn't just one more representation, but it's a quality of representation. I've lost confidence in that idea. And so affect, probably you could do it other ways, but affect is I think, one way of modifying behavior in a systematic way. And you know Minsky's work at all on computer emotion? So his idea of a computer emotion, as I remember, is it's a state change that induces a systematic alteration in contingencies. And that's what feeling does. It doesn't just update one or another little bit. So when I get frightened, that alters my attention, it alters my motivation, it alters the inferences that I'll perform. And so you can think that affect, that you'll need a system that can do that. And affect is one way of doing it is to give you a conscious token. Cool. Yeah. So that's the idea.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for your questions. What is the work that John was referring to about restaurant problem?